welcome everybody. My name is Loretta Lees. I'm Director of the Initiative on Cities. I'm also the co-organiser, along with Mimi, of the Boston Urban Salon, which is a kind of organisation that brings together urbanists across different institutions in Boston. So we have Harvard, Boston University, Tufts, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and what am I missing? Northeastern. But we're also in the process of trying to expand that network out to really kind of become a more encompassing kind of, I guess, urban kind of reading room for people in Boston. So it's our pleasure today to host the first Boston Urban Salon event of this particular year. And we're going to be talking with Benjamin Bradlow about his new book, Urban Power, Democracy and Inequality in São Paulo and Johannesburg. I'll introduce him in a minute, but just in terms of the way it's going to go, Benjamin's going to talk about the book, Marcus is going to do a kind of commentary, then Mimi a kind of commentary, then we'll open up to Q&A, and then there's kind of refreshments for afterwards. Okay? So, by way of introduction, so Benjamin Bradlow is an Assistant Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. His new book, Urban Power, Democracy and Inequality in São Paulo and Johannesburg, explores why some cities are more effective at reducing inequalities in the built environment. Bradlow examines the effectiveness of urban governance in two megacities in young democracies. So that's his particular context. São Paulo, Brazil, and Johannesburg, South Africa. Both cities, of course, emerged from periods of authoritarian rule with similarly high inequalities and similar policy priorities to get those inequalities down. So he explores how both cities handled their bureaucracies and social movements, how embeddedness and cohesion have factored into implementing policy changes. And I think I may as well just introduce everybody while we're at it. Sure. So, Mimi Scheller is the Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and has over 15 years of academic leadership experience. Dr. Scheller was the founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities, which is one of my most favourite journals, the founding co-director of the Centre for Mobilities at Lancaster University in the UK, like me, she fled to the US, and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility. She was one of the kind of leaders, key players to establish the new mobilities paradigm, particularly in the discipline of geography, which is my own discipline, and actually in sociology as well, with John Erie, and is considered a key theorist in the interdisciplinary field of mobilities research, but also in Caribbean studies. Marcus Walton is one of our own from Boston University. He's an assistant professor in political science. His research focuses on democracy and protest in North and Sub-Saharan Africa and how the legacy of colonialism paved the way for post-colonial politics in the 21st century. He's currently doing some really interesting research on protest movements in Cairo, also Johannesburg and Lagos. So three amazing kind of academics, all focused on the urban. Wonderful. So over to you, Benjamin, if you want to introduce us to your book. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much to everyone for being here, to the Urban Salon and Initiative on Cities for hosting, and especially to Mimi and Marcus for generously being willing to offer comments on this book. This talk draws from my book called Urban Power, which was published just a few weeks ago by Princeton University Press. And I'm told I need to say this, it's available to order now. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to draw from my field-based research in Johannesburg and São Paulo to argue for a set of conceptual tools to explain why some cities are more effective than others in reducing inequality. So about 10 years ago, humanity reached a new threshold. And that is, for the first time, the majority of people now live in cities, and the character of contemporary urban growth is a defining feature of inequality today. Not long after humanity crossed that urban threshold in 2014, the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change included the first significant references to informal settlements in both its reports on the mitigation of carbon emissions and adaptation to the effects of those emissions. So this was the first time that the leading synthesis of published climate science had a standalone chapter on urbanization and cities. A key takeaway from this work was that urban informal settlements are both the first refuge of climate migrants within the global south and are the zones of deepest vulnerability to climate impacts. So two of the cities that are responsible for the global explosion of city growth are Johannesburg and São Paulo. Each of these cities are predicted to be among a group of 41 so-called megacities that are defined as being home to at least 10 million people over the next 10 years. Today, both Brazil and South Africa rank in the top 10 of the World Bank's calculations of international Gini coefficients, which measures inequalities of income. And residential informal settlements are the quintessential image of this inequality, which you can see on this slide. So I'll show you today that while both cities are clearly very unequal and have both pursued policies to reduce inequality, they're not equally unequal. And this is particularly so in the provision of public goods, often by local government. So my book focuses on the distribution of three kinds of public goods: housing, transportation, and sanitation. For today, I'm going to focus on housing, and to the extent that I bring in sanitation, it'll be through the lens of housing and land use law. So each city has generated policies intended to reduce what are conceived as quote unquote backlogs of housing demands, but they've done so in very different ways. Government subsidized housing projects in Johannesburg are delivered exclusively in the existing peripheries where apartheid once designated Black-only townships. These projects are all on undeveloped so-called greenfield land, and residents of informal settlements are subject to frequent evictions from both local government and private landowners. In contrast, in São Paulo, I'll describe a set of new policy tools that the city has used to reserve land for housing projects outside of the market, as well as to upgrade existing informal settlements where they are, what planners and architects refer to as in situ upgrading. And as a result, the city has ended communal evictions by local government. So the effects of these policies have also changed conditions within informal settlements, because the provision of services like sanitation largely depends on land use law. So in this chart, I took the statistics from the first census after transitions to democracy in both countries and the most recent census. There's a very recent census that's come out, but the data hasn't been processed. And as you'll see, it's not about a time period that I'm talking about in this talk. In this period, both cities have had informal settlement populations between 10 and 15%, but the quality of life in these areas has diverged significantly. So in Johannesburg, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet was 36% in '96, rising slightly to 47% by 2011. And the relative indeterminacy of change, that is the relative lack of change in the darkening of these graphs, reflects that lack of change in the provision of sanitation in informal settlements. In São Paulo, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet was actually lower than Johannesburg at 25% in 1991, but this almost tripled by 2011 to 68%. And here you can see a more linear trend in the darkening of these maps over time, which reflects that improved provision. So compared to Johannesburg, São Paulo is clearly a positive case. There's also substantial literature among Brazilian researchers that's shown that improvements in São Paulo are particularly notable among a highly variable range of cities, even within Brazil. So this divergence between Johannesburg and São Paulo suggests an empirical puzzle. Why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? And today I want to share with you how the combination of two factors explain why governing regimes in cities are or are not able to realize a more equal distribution of urban public goods. First, the local state that is embedded in civil society, and particularly I'm going to talk about a sphere of housing movements in civil society, And second, an institutional sphere of the local state that is cohesive. I'll define these terms in more depth in a moment, but before I do, I want to explain why I chose these cases in the first place. There were three components to the social basis for the struggle for democracy in both countries. First, a new independent trade union federation. Second, neighborhood and citywide social movements focused on housing and basic services. And third, a political party of the left. This kind of alliance has been described in political sociology as a, quote, social movement unionist alliance. Now, remember, these are new democracies. In older democracies like the US, constitutions are exclusively focused on civil and political rights. But the social movement unionist alliance in both Brazil and South Africa was heavily involved in negotiations over new constitutions. And it's no accident that these constitutions ended up with significant social and economic rights. So first, you see new rights to housing, sanitation, and transportation in both constitutions. You also see provision for decentralized fiscal transfers and implementing authority that's allocated to local government. So this means that local government has both the fiscal capacity and the legal power to make it a meaningful place to analyze how well it changes the distribution of public goods. In comparison, in the US, the municipal tier does not exist in the Constitution. So this all led me to focus on the politics of local government in order to make sense of conflict over distributing these public goods. So what are ways to think about what we should expect to happen? The urban literature in sociology tends to assume that the political story is driven by globalization and neoliberalism, or driven by a programmatic orientation of local property elites towards economic growth. There's a power resources literature in political sociology that's more traditionally focused on the politics of distribution. This is largely a literature about social democracy at the national scale. And this is focused on the role of democracy in empowering coalitions of working class movements and political parties of the left, as well as on the internal organization of working class movements as determinants of redistributive success. So while the urban literature would predict deepening inequalities in both cases, the social movement unionist histories of both countries would predict reduced inequalities in these cases. Now, these are either theories of macro level structure or of how social forces align to produce governing regimes aimed at changing inequality. And what's largely missing is an institutional dimension in these theories of the politics of reducing inequality. It's this institutional scale or level that mediates the core relational conflict of cities between market elites, particularly those with an investment in the property regime of the city, and the informalized, unhoused poor. So one way to think about bridging these literatures is to ask, under what conditions will mobilization translate into making these institutions matter for redistribution? The work that I undertook for this book was field-based across 16 months in 2015 through 2018 in both cities, largely focused on 225 semi-structured interviews with all of the key actors who are involved in conflicts in the policy arenas of housing, sanitation, and collective transportation. And I augmented this fieldwork with archival research into policy documents, trade publications, NGO publications, in many cases to triangulate accounts that I was getting from the interview data. And after my research, I found that two factors explain when and why the local state is capable of changing the distribution of public goods in the city. The first is a local state that's embedded in civil society. And I define embeddedness as the ties of the local state to civil society that produce the ideas and space within bureaucratic agencies for redistributive policy change. So to illustrate, I was looking for things like, do mid-level bureaucrats regularly interact with movements demanding things that they're supposed to be working on? Are there movements even working within the bureaucracy itself? And the second factor is what I call cohesive institutions. And I define cohesion as the coordinating capacity of the local state to implement policy changes. This is not just a general form of what's often referred to as state capacity. Municipal government is distinctive because it's a delegated scale that's regulated through a national institutional framework. So cohesion captures these distinct dimensions of coordinating delegated authority. We can think of a horizontal dimension coordinating across line agencies within the city, and a vertical dimension coordinating across scales of government, local, state or provincial, national or federal government. And here I'm looking to find evidence of policies, reforms, and circulation of bureaucrats that directly address the coordination of delivery of public goods. So this is how we can think about the argument in a cross-sectional 2x2 table. And remember, these configurations explain the institutional reforms that correlate to material outcomes in the distribution of public goods. So when we have low embeddedness and low cohesion, I call this a rentier regime characterized by narrow elite capture. When we have high embeddedness and low cohesion, I call this a mobilizational regime, where we have policies targeting redistribution but lacking financial and administrative capacity to deliver. When you have low embeddedness and high cohesion, I call this a managerial regime, where you have programmatic top-down administration targeting economic growth. And finally, that elusive configuration of high embeddedness and high cohesion, what I call an integrationist regime, where you have effective administration of policies targeting redistribution. And I want to underscore that in theory, no city is immutably in one of these ideal types. And part of my task here is to show why time and sequence are critical for understanding why cities are characterized by high or low embeddedness or cohesion at different points in time. So now I want to move into the cases. And one thing I'm going to do is show how sequence matters for where each of these two cities ends up. As we'll see, both cities start their democratic periods in what looks like a mobilizational configuration of high embeddedness and low cohesion. But Johannesburg moves from this to a rentier configuration of low embeddedness and low cohesion. So to set the stage in Johannesburg, housing movements and neighborhood associations, allied to an independent trade union federation, united under the banner of the United Democratic Front, or UDF, in the 1980s. And this is a poster from a rally that the UDF held in Johannesburg's Soweto Township in 1983. At this rally, they were protesting what were then called community councils, and these were unelected local authorities whose intentionally poor delivery outcomes produced one of the central demands of the UDF during negotiations over the transition to democracy in 1994, characterized by the slogan, "One city with one tax base." And the idea of this demand was that in order to overcome the divides of apartheid urban development, richer white areas would cross-subsidize poorer Black areas through a central municipal property tax collection. So to preview how this case plays out, the case starts with high embeddedness. The initial movement orientation of the ANC allied to the UDF leads it to high levels of initial investment in housing and sanitation at the local level in Johannesburg. But the city's financial capacity is eroded by what I found were hidden strategies of resistance by traditional white elites in the city. So the ANC, the African National Congress government, at this time this was the government of Nelson Mandela, takes an explicit decision that its social movement allies should demobilize in order to not interfere with the capacity of government to implement. And this makes it difficult for local government in Johannesburg to continue a redistributive agenda in the face of hidden reaction by white elites. And I want to underscore that these outcomes are particularly surprising because the anti-apartheid movement in Johannesburg was in many ways much more powerful than its analog movement in São Paulo. The movement for Black political liberation and democracy made housing and urban land a core mobilizing issue. So after democratization in '94, the explicit priority of the ANC was to use housing and land use policy to do what it called to deracialize the city. So while the legacies of apartheid were likely to be strong, this is a case where we have strong mobilization that combines race and class, along with a dominant party alignment across local, provincial, and national government. So what you're looking at here is an official map of the municipal governing arrangement that actually came out of the negotiations for a new municipal structure in Johannesburg. And it's a bit confusing and fractured, and that's precisely the point. A critical compromise in the rushed negotiations before the first elections in '94 led to the institution of 4 municipal substructures that had strong powers, including the power to collect property taxes. So for movements in the Black townships, the historic social base of the new ANC government, this was considered a betrayal. Not only did the municipal substructures have powers of tax collection, but they also had a proportional vote in the city council. So the Central City Authority, which was now led by politicians who came from the civic movements in Soweto, moved quickly to make new capital investments in housing and basic infrastructure in former Black townships and informal settlements. But this would become vulnerable to hidden strategies of traditional white elites who could not directly challenge the political legitimacy of these investments. One civic movement leader from Soweto who entered the city council during this time described the sense of betrayal. They, referring to the ANC, gave more power to the white section of the city by making it proportional rather than based on an open vote, where it's obvious we would have swamped them. So this power of municipal substructures became an attractive mechanism for traditional white elites, both property owners and property developers. These are groups that in a lot of urban theory don't always see eye to eye. They could not directly attack the legitimacy of redistributive policies of the central city government, which focused on investments in housing and basic infrastructure in Black townships. This was in many ways the raison d'etre of the new ANC government. The role of racialization was particularly important for emphasizing the legitimacy of the new government. A Black majority had extremely high political legitimacy in this moment. So traditional white elites pursued a more hidden route to undermine the capacity to actually implement these policies. They pursued a strategy of ring fencing property tax collections to the sub-municipal level through what were called city improvement districts. And these also exist in many cities in the US. One of the early examples of these city improvement districts was in Sandton, pictured here. It's an area that's often described in promotional documents of both the private and public sector as Africa's richest square mile. And the founder of one of these first city improvement districts was quite candid with me in describing the strategy. She said, we definitely weren't going to give our contributions to the city, referring to the central city fiscus, because there would be no guarantee that it would be spent in the area, referring to her neighborhood where she was organizing the city improvement district. So we did a deal. And then she went on to describe to me her relationship with sub-municipal officials that enabled this deal. So there were 2 key factors in this strategy that left the previously embedded local state increasingly without the ties to civil society to effectively countervail the power of traditional white elites. First, you have the demobilization of largely Black housing movements in the townships. The rush to complete a negotiated democratic transition in '94 was coupled with an increasingly open ideological position of the ANC that the newly Black-led government would be charged with undoing the legacies of apartheid, and this would be a state-led project. This was coupled with an explicit insistence on the demobilization of movements that had previously developed strong capacities to challenge government and hold it to account. And then secondly, we see how traditional white elites pursue strategies to disable the capacity of the ANC government in Johannesburg to finance and deliver on its redistribution-oriented goals. So I've described so far how Johannesburg's lack of embeddedness helped produce low horizontal cohesion, that is the capacity to coordinate within the local government bureaucracy. But we can also see how it did not develop vertical cohesion. In housing and land use, the first reason for this is that national housing policy was to invest in subsidized housing production to be managed by provincial rather than local governments. And this helped create an incentive to develop low-income housing in the cheapest areas of the city, reproducing the traditional poor and Black peripheries of the city. And pictured here is an example of one such housing development in the far southern periphery of Johannesburg. Despite this, the city tried to rein in private property developers who themselves were creating a new type of wealthy periphery in the northern parts of the city, further and further away from the sprawling Black townships of the south. The city did so by instituting what it called an urban development boundary. The idea here was to prevent private development that would strain the financial resources of the city to build bulk infrastructure like roads and sewers to these new wealthy developments. But developers learned to venue shop for building permits by approaching provincial government as opposed to municipal government. And this allowed them to violate the city's urban development boundary. When I interviewed a longtime bureaucrat in land use management in the city, I still can picture her surrounded by piles of files of permit applications when she sighed with frustration and said to me, these guys, they saw a loophole, and then most applications were processed by province. Now they had powers to disregard any of our policies. So in 2010, the municipality eventually won a constitutional court case against the Gauteng province that its boundaries should be respected, but challenges by the main organization of property owners and developers in the city meant that key provisions of this court decision have yet to be implemented almost 15 years later. So in sum, in Johannesburg, we see weakening political and social support from local government space and movements to countervail the structural power of traditional white elites. These white elites organize and strategize around the color line to pursue hidden strategies to undermine redistribution-oriented reforms. In a recent paper, I refer to these strategies as weapons of the strong. And the result is a city government without capacity to regulate land in such a way that it can achieve its redistributive goals, as ambitious as something like spatial transformation, deracializing the city, or even the more simple task of enforcing an urban boundary. So this is, when we go back to this 2x2 table, this is the space that Johannesburg travels through. I now want to move to São Paulo. And to preview this case, we see a similar starting point to Johannesburg. High embeddedness of the local state with housing movements produces a raft of new investments in housing, especially through the upgrading of informal settlements. But unlike Johannesburg, after reaction by traditional elites, a more resilient set of movements keeps the local state embedded and in turn builds increasing bureaucratic cohesion to deliver. So we see a sequence where a mobilizational regime transforms into something that compared to Joburg looks like more of an integrationist regime. The first mayoral term of the Workers' Party, or PT in its Portuguese initials, was led by Mayor Luísa Erundina, pictured here. And when she was elected, she promised an inversion of priorities in the city's budget to establish what she called a PT way of governing. During this period, we see the beginning of embedded ties that would become durable across subsequent governing regimes. In order for that to happen, Erundina's administration had to create the space for movements to enter the bureaucratic sphere in local government. And this was uncomfortable even for a top housing official in the administration like Herminia Maricatu, an academic who was already quite well known in the city as an advocate for poor people's housing. And when I interviewed her about this period, she had something between a knowing wink and an exasperated eye roll in describing her work. In that period, social movements would occupy our offices 1 week on, 1 week off. They always wanted to speak with us, and my life wasn't easy because they were placing constant demands on our office. So that's the voice of the highest ranking housing official in the city. But the numbers of street level bureaucrats doubled in the housing department under Erundina from 350 to 700. And the approach to administration of these officials was distributed across the geography of the city, including in the far peripheries that are home to most of Sao Paulo's informal settlements. These projects focused on self-build housing projects known in Portuguese as mutirão, through which the city was able to begin extending sanitation services. So on your left is a picture from one of the first such projects. And these types of projects relied on coordination between city officials and housing movements, which enabled an approach that planners and architects call in situ upgrading. This is a kind of complex form of informal settlement upgrading where people live, and it requires close interaction between residents and officials, as complications like temporary relocation in order to complete a sewer pipe requires high degrees of trust and expectation of follow-through. So here's a quote from one of the street-level bureaucrats at this time. He actually would later become quite a senior official in the city. And he described his work during this time. The difference, I think, was the capillary nature of policy. You had technical officials in different parts of the city who worked directly with the people. The people were their primary reference point, and they were always near a housing project. This was the embryo of what we called local government. So these experiences of embeddedness created a base for developing broader cohesion as national policy began to empower local governments to act. But the lack of cohesion in both the horizontal financial dimension as well as the vertical interscalar dimension opened the doors for reaction. Erundina lost her re-election in '92, and this was followed by right-wing governments that canceled the self-build mutirão programs and increased evictions of people living in informal settlements. And one of the leaders of a long-standing federation of housing movements in the city described an almost warlike footing during this period. From the beginning of '93, she told me, until the last mobilization before municipal elections in 2000, the response from the government was against us. They began an attack on the housing movements. But housing movements in the peripheries had not been demobilized, especially in comparison to what we see in Johannesburg, and they were energized to both fight for the reinstatement of these programs and to fight the growing frequency of evictions. And by 2000, they became a core bloc that would help bring the PT back to power in the city. Now, my informants in Sao Paulo local government kept suggesting that something had changed to make their work more effective beginning in the 2000s beyond just the return of the PT to the mayoral seat. And it turned out that the federal government had developed policy instruments that could help cities to integrate line agencies, especially planning, housing, and sanitation. So these laws emerged from demands that had first been made by housing movements in the 90s. The Federal City Statute of 2001 established a legal framework for Sao Paulo's first master plan during the democratic era, and this was the first master plan of any large city in the country in the democratic period. This plan designated what are called zones of special social interest, which made it possible to upgrade informal settlements without first finalizing individual land title. This municipal innovation drew on the federal constitution's provision for what is called a social function of property, and it amounted to an assertion of the public right to relativize private property. A participatory municipal housing council established in 2002 under this same city statute provided a framework for joint deliberation by housing movements and property developers alike in developing zoning and housing policies. So the longtime representative of Sao Paulo private real estate in the city described to me a major shift in how the real estate sector had to do business in these new deliberative spaces. We can't enter the game thinking that we're going to get everything that we want. The master plan, for it to be good for our city, it should mediate and perceive what is relevant from society's point of view. What is the public interest? Now, I don't want you to say that Ben is being very Pollyannish in interpreting this quote. This guy is speaking to a foreign researcher and wants to give an agreeable spin. But this was very different from the kind of talk that I heard from similarly positioned people in the property sector in Johannesburg. they were extremely dismissive of both grassroots activists and government planning efforts altogether. And further, they tended to present their interests as equivalent to the public interest. So many of the personnel from the Erundina era persisted within the bureaucracy, and they spread out not only in the housing department, but also in planning, land use, and sanitation, all of which are located in this Marcinelli building in downtown Sao Paulo. We might think of this building as having become a physical representation of this horizontal cohesion. The proliferation of these bureaucrats with ties to housing movements across the departments in the building created a more networked set of ties across key departments for coordinating residential slum upgrading. And this circulation of bureaucrats has been confirmed by recent network analyses of municipal officials conducted by Brazil-based researchers. And this is a key form of horizontal cohesion that I find is precipitated through embeddedness in a sphere of housing movements. So federal law continued to empower Sao Paulo's local government, what I call vertical cohesion. So the passage of the National Sanitation Law in 2007 empowered city governments to ensure that state-run sanitation companies, in Sao Paulo state, this is a semi-private sanitation company, would have to respond to public municipal priorities. So officials in both the state-run sanitation company and the municipal sanitation department reported to me that the increased regulatory power for the municipality enabled better integration of these priorities into the state company's plans. So this is a photo of the Guarapiranga Reserve in the south of the city, which is one of the most difficult areas in the city to service with sanitation. For 30 years, it's been a major area of concern due to problems of water pollution and flood risk. But after the passage of this national sanitation law, a center-right local administration made its upgrading a priority. And it was able to do so in part through the flexible application of the zones of special social interest provision from the master plan. Now, this stands in sharp contrast to the deficits in sanitation provisioning in Johannesburg that I found were due to the inflexibility of land use law, particularly compared to a tool like the zones of special social interest provision. So Betsy França, who was the housing secretary in the city from 2005 to 2012, described the pressure that pushed her office to develop the capacity to make the Guarapiranga settlements a priority. She said, in Sao Paulo, we have serious movements. They have histories and representativity, and they should exist. No, they're always there fighting, and public authorities are sometimes struggling to keep up with them. Now, many movements that I spoke to actually saw this woman as an enemy because she was in a center-right administration. But the outcomes and the interview data indicate to me a more institutionalized setting for co-producing improved neighborhood infrastructure by integrating social movements into policy and administration. So this was a period where embeddedness of the local state in a sphere of housing movements went hand in hand in pushing even center-right governments to maintain a project of cohesive institution building to deliver. So in the Sao Paulo case, we see continued mobilization of a social movement base as a countervailing force. As a consequence, traditional elites are forced to reckon with a more redistributive vision of the city, an institutionalized redistributive vision of the city, and we see increased local capacity to finance and plan for redistribution. So this is a study of two cities that go through a particular sequence of configurations of embeddedness and cohesion. And in relative terms, we can see how these two cities have traveled through the conceptual space that I've presented here. But before I end, I want to return to the global picture. I began by asking, why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? It's about both the ties of the local state to civil society and the internal dynamics of coordinating local state action. And I'm suggesting that embeddedness does not necessarily undercut cohesion or vice versa, but that they can actually be mutually reinforcing. So in the book, I trace these dynamics across time, primarily in the two cities, Johannesburg and Sao Paulo. I've told you largely about housing today. When I integrate my findings across the sectors of housing, sanitation, and transportation, I'm able to take this argument in a more global direction. And in the book's conclusion, I illustrate this briefly with some other cases that could be useful for seeing how far this approach to institutional dimensions of distributive politics in cities can travel. So first, you have the rentier city, which I illustrate through the case of Flint, Michigan. In the late 2000s, private water administration consultants were hired by the state of Michigan to receive lucrative contracts to produce reports that denied many of the problems with the water supply that made it unusable for the city's 100,000 residents. On a much larger scale, the informal, deregulated, and captured modes of urban planning in India have been found to be endemic. Second, you have cases of high embeddedness and low cohesion, a mobilizational city. So both Washington, D.C. under Marion Barry and the Aam Aadmi Party in New Delhi are cases of movement-led regimes in capital cities with weak institutional powers. And in large part, the inability to deliver in these two cases can be explained by constant undercutting by national government authorities, hence low cohesion. Third, you have forms of the managerial city. And the key here is you have a programmatic business-led agenda. So in the US, this is essentially, for any of you who have taken any urban sociology or urban theory, this is what we would refer to as a modal growth machine. But also in China, particularly in the 2000s, you see many cases where local governments pursue projects primarily or even exclusively aimed at hitting GDP targets. And then finally, you have that elusive integrative city of high embeddedness and cohesion. And so Amsterdam in the 1990s was somewhat famously described as an example of a just city by Susan Feinstein, where pressure by housing movements underpinned strong national investments into the city government for housing. In the US, the case that most resembles this, at least among the universe of post-civil rights movement Black mayor-led cities, is Harold Washington's Chicago in the 80s. And one of the key dimensions that I want to emphasize here in terms of institutional cohesion is that in Chicago at this time, you see real investment in housing and infrastructure in marginalized neighborhoods. And this stands in contrast to the more exclusive focus on affirmative action in procurement that we see in a number of other cases of post-civil rights movement Black mayors in the 70s and 80s. And we can think of the period of post-civil rights movement Black mayors as particularly analogous to the cases that I study in Brazil and South Africa, as this was a period that followed major democratizing reforms at the national level due to strong social mobilization, particularly by urban social movements. So this work, I want to suggest, offers a couple lessons for understanding the relationship of urban governing regimes to inequality. Variation in the coordination of power to distribute is at the core of how this work contributes to a new global urban social science. First, we can bring institutions back into how we think about the sources of urban inequalities. And second, we can bring the city back into how we think about institutional change and the reproduction of inequality. Cities allow us to disaggregate how and why coordination problems of state action are contested. And the city is a fundamentally contested space in which economic inequality is both reproduced and in some rare instances reduced. I've argued today for one set of tools by which to categorize and understand the variation that arises in conflicts over public goods distribution. It's this variation of urban institutions that will go a long way towards explaining the inequalities that will characterize humanity's urban future. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share this work with you all, and I'm looking forward to comments from my interlocutors and the broader interlocutors who are with us today. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I want to thank Ben for coming here to present his book, which I don't think is an exaggeration to say is a tremendous achievement for several reasons. The first of which is more personal, which is I met Ben when he was first starting this research. Took a social theory course together with Patrick Heller. At the time, I didn't know anything about South Africa, and I was lost in terms of my dissertation. Patrick had convinced me I should study South Africa, and he told me you should talk to Ben. Ben was the first person I met who had actually studied South Africa. He gave me a lot of tips, put me in touch with many people that was crucial to my research. So seeing that progression from then to seeing the book is truly amazing. In addition to that, I just finished research this summer in Cape Town, looking at affordable housing. I was talking to members of the organization Indefuna Nkwazi. Two things that they mentioned in affordable housing that were really tricky is the fact that many of the departments that were tasked with dealing with issues of affordable housing were siloed. They didn't talk to each other enough. And that prior to the mid-2010s, social movements were quite weak fighting for affordable housing. Immediately when they told me these things, I thought of Ben's work and his research. So there's a practical application, but I also know that this book is a tremendous achievement because my students can attest to it. The book's been, or at least the research within the book has been extremely helpful in my own course on urban politics of the Global South. I look forward to teaching more of his chapters in the future. And I'm sure many of the students in the audience, perhaps because of their exams, will be very interested in asking Ben questions about state capacity and cohesion and embeddedness. If they're not already tired of those terms. But let's hope not. Okay. There are three major strengths that I see coming out of the book that are really important. The first is the kind of precision that it provides. So it may be the case that there are not two concepts in social science as a whole that are both more specific and yet more amorphous than civil society and state capacity. Specific in the sense that as scholars, we have a sense of how it manifests. When someone says civil society, you might have something specific in mind in terms of your cases, what you would think about. Similar with state capacity, we can think of certain outcomes that would fall under that heading. Yet the terms can be quite amorphous in the way that they're used. Typically, we'll get a 2x2, civil society, strong or weak, state capacity, strong or weak, and it's not clear what that means. How do we evaluate these things? What are sort of the mechanisms? So Ben's work helps us think more precisely about these concepts, and thinking beyond just general evaluations to what actually is important when we talk about civil society, particularly the relationship to the state, and what is important when we're talking about state capacity, and he speaks to his concept in cohesion. So it's giving us tools to think beyond these concepts that are critical for us, and yet often used in ways that can be unclear. So the precision of the book, I think, is really an important tool, and it contributes to the literature in that way. But what it also does, as he talks about in the literature review, it breaks up this hegemony, these concepts of growth machine, these ideas of neoliberalism, which are often used as explaining many of these outcomes that Ben is talking about. I went to a talk very recently where basically the person was talking about urban slum governance in a particular country, and the only concept that they were trying to compare it to was growth machine. So growth machines was the outcome they were saying that literature had discussed, and they had a different theory, right? And that was basically it. Urban power helps us get beyond those two concepts, and in particular, what it brings in is the idea of the state, which tends to be missing from these concepts of growth machine and neoliberalism. Now, building on the works of Peter Evans, Ben is telling us a lot about not just the state in terms of developmental state in a broader sense, but specifically the local state, especially the relationship between parties in the state, which we often don't get in this developmental state literature. The last point I would say in terms of the contribution here is that as someone who has spent some time, several years at this point, working in South Africa, this book is a contribution because it helps interact with a lot of important scholarship by South African scholars, but also pushing them beyond more parochial borders. So South Africa has a extremely rich literature thinking about some of these issues of urban politics. And yet at times, scholars can be quite hesitant to think beyond South Africa. Now, there are examples where scholars have done that. Marie Huxemeyer would be an example of someone who has compared South Africa with Brazil. But I think the comparative work and the comparative lens is quite important for those of us who are interested in studying South Africa. And this book provides a perfect illustration of that. But even beyond that, when you think comparatively, from the narratives that I've heard thus far, a lot of times it becomes very sort of sweeping, broad sweeping generalizations. The ANC sold out, PT didn't, right? So Ben's giving us not only a more in-depth understanding of that, but also how, even after the democratic transition in Brazil, you have different phases that show us the capacity of the Brazilian state, of the state in Sao Paulo, to deliver on these outcomes. Right? So it's not just this one clear story in which, since the democratic transition, it's been rosy. So those kind of variations within the case I find to be quite critical, in addition to the sort of comparative. Okay. So now I want you to forget everything I said, because there's a couple questions that I have. These are more just thoughts that can open up, I think, a bit of a discussion. You can answer the ones that you feel comfortable with. I ask these questions not because I don't think you address them in the book. Many of them you actually do address to some extent, but I want to think about some of the external validity and the ability to apply your findings to other cases. So that's sort of where these questions are coming from. So the first question is, to what extent is urban power in a fixed sense versus a capacity within a set of favorable circumstances? So sometimes embeddedness, as you describe it, sounds like strength of networks between state and civil society. Sometimes it sounds like, or it relies on, a kind of strength of civil society in a general sense. I know I just talked about how the book gets beyond that, but like I said, forget what I said before. Because in the literature, we tend to get these things as being fairly fixed. Civil society is strong or it's weak, right? One could say civil society, at least around housing in South Africa, is weak, and it's strong in Brazil, right? So sometimes it sounds like embeddedness is really about this power or strength of these networks between the state and civil society. And sometimes it sounds like it just relies on the strength of civil society. Additionally, sometimes cohesion sounds like it's a coordinating power across multiple departments, as Ben describes. And yet other times when I read the book, it sounded like an alignment of electoral strength, perhaps the city and the national level, or also the fact that Lula was president during a very favorable time in terms of global economic conditions, seeing high levels of economic growth, obviously leaving office with extremely high favorability ratings. So this brings me back to the question. And you mentioned this in the book, the idea of internal and external circumstances, right? But to what extent is urban power actually a power that the city has in a fixed sense versus a capacity to act within favorable circumstances? Another way of asking that is, cities that don't have these same type of favorable circumstances, do they have the same type of flexibility that you're talking about in São Paulo? The next question I wanted to ask, this goes back actually to Peter Evans. In Peter Evans' first book, when he talks about developmental states, he uses these different categories, compares like Japan, Brazil, and the predatory case is Zaire. So the African case is basically the negative case. This is not uncommon, some comparative studies. Now Ben is quite more specific. He's using Johannesburg, a specific city in a specific country. Yet it is also true in the 2x2 we saw there, that Indian cities for an entire decade are also in one of the quadrants. As someone who works on Africa, this begs the question for me, if Johannesburg or South Africa is a negative case, what do we say about the rest of the continent? Or perhaps another way to put the question, if we think about the Indian context, are there not significant differences amongst Indian cities even in the 2000s? So one way I might rephrase the question is, if you wanted to think about these cities that wouldn't even rise to the level of being a Johannesburg, either in Africa or somewhere else in the world, is there another type of criteria you would look at? Are there other factors that you might add to this framework that would allow us to do that? Because if low is basically going to be Johannesburg, as someone who works comparatively on Africa, that doesn't leave a lot of room to be thinking about other cases. Mm-hmm. The other question I wanted to ask about is how far this sort of managerial phase do you think it can get us? When I say us, I mean a particular case. Let's say China. China was on my mind when I was reading this. say one day the CCP decides that they actually want to invest in many of these same types of public goods you're describing. Is there any reason to believe that within this managerial phase, without embeddedness, they would still be, they could not be more successful than what we described in Sao Paulo? Or are there limits to what can be achieved, or do you think could be achieved within a managerial phase? The last question I will ask, and you get to it at the very end here. Obviously, as we know, the Nobel Prize this year was awarded to Gemma Robinson for institutions. So what are you really telling us about institutions? It's clear that they matter, but can they be fleeting? Usually when we study institutionalization, we think of something, I don't want to say embedded, something perhaps not fixed, but something that has staying power. At least that's what institutions are supposed to be doing. Yet part of your story is how institutions can go from being strong to weak, not necessarily during long time periods, or how they can improve quite quickly as well. One of the reasons I'm interested in this, and this is outside of the scope of what you're talking about here, but also to what extent were institutions affected under Bolsonaro, for instance, in Brazil? So what are the lessons about institutions that this book tries to impart on us? I'll leave it at that.
Unstressful, you know. Should we leave the questions, or do you want to respond now, or go to Mimi first? What's the best?
How do you normally do it?
If you want to
It's what you
respond
want to
now,
Okay.
kind of
Yeah,
while it's on
well,
everybody's mind.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah,
sure,
while
sure,
it's
sure.
fresh, and
Okay.
then- Yeah.
So Marcus, thank you for that very generous and personal set of comments about the work. And you've been engaging with, we've been discussing this work for a long time, and yet you've asked a whole bunch of new questions that we've never talked about before. So nothing has been planted. Let's see, I kind of want to start, I want to start with the fourth question first. Argue with the Nobel Prize winners. So basically the like thumbnail version of their work is extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. And that's kind of like what determines development. Now, so that's a very generalized way of talking about this stuff. I don't think that I'm necessarily arguing with, it's in a way it's kind of hard. It's hard to argue with that, though some people have said that China doesn't necessarily fit their model. They have argued that China does actually fit their model. But they don't have a theory really for where inclusive institutions come from, other than like the type of the type of colonialism. And I guess like larger settler colonialism is good for them, which is a bit of a weird position to take. Yeah. But this is getting at much more detailed dynamics of what is the origin of institutional performance, and it has to, and it's part of what I want this work to suggest is that there's something a lot more contingent than just deep histories of 400 years. And these are both post-colonial societies. And part of the goal of people who work, for many people who work in the global South, and both of us included, one overarching goal of our work is to focus on what is possible in post-colonial societies, and to, in kind of like a big picture view, to push against this view that there's a kind of like, there's a very widespread defeatism about what governments can do in post-colonial societies. There's also a defeatism that's associated with some of the cruder versions of global neoliberalism as shaping all cities. That there's no space for variation across cities in a neoliberal macro political economy. And this work is also trying to push against that. So yeah, this is a much, I would describe this as a meso-level view of institutions. This is not AJR style 400 years of history and institutions. That brings me to the point you make about Evans and treating an African case as a negative case, and like, where does that leave us for talking about variation within Africa? And I know that in your work, you use South Africa as a positive case. And I think there's certainly something to that. And, you know, we've talked about this. My purpose here is not to suggest that Johannesburg is archetypally African. It's not even archetypally South African. There's variation within South African cities. And part of what's important about Johannesburg compared to other cities within South Africa, at least in the time period that I'm studying, which ends at 2016, which was a bit of a watershed municipal election in Johannesburg, is that unlike some cities, particularly Cape Town, there's been a more consistent normative thrust of municipal governance towards redistribution. Whereas I think Cape Town has been managed much more like a growth machine. In fact, for many years, the main agency in Cape Town that was dealing with informal settlements was not the housing department. It was what's called an anti-land invasion unit. So basically, the management of informal settlements in Cape Town was an agency that evicts people. So there's a difference even within South Africa that I think is important. And I don't think this work should be taken to be making claims about African cities broadly. The only claim that I would make here is that there's variation across African cities. I think we're seeing some of the higher performing African cities that we see elsewhere in the continent tend to at least aspire to forms of managerialism, often pushed in that direction by external funding for key infrastructure projects. But my only point about African cities would be look for the variation, and that's what your work is doing. Then finally, I want to give time for more discussion, but the question of, is urban power a power or a capacity? It's curious because on the one hand, embeddedness seems to be doing a lot of the work in your rendition of the book, and I think that's not an inaccurate rendition of the book, but a lot of the evidence of the book is not actually about the movements, but it's about what happens within the state. And so all I'm suggesting about movements is that there's a fundamental relationality in what happens inside the state and what happens within movements. And in fact, what happened in the state in Sao Paulo shaped a sphere of housing movements that could be much more resilient across multiple generations of housing movements that undergo a very typical movement process of radical action, anti-government protest, and then more institutionalized kinds of movement action. And you have 3 generations of those kinds of movements in Sao Paulo. And the reason why they've been able to maintain a citywide character targeting policy reform is because of what's happened inside the state. So the movements are formed just as much by this process as the state is being formed by this process. But thank you so much for those comments and questions.
Thank you. So Mimi Scheller's going to.
Great, thank you. Wow, so wonderful exposition of the book. For anyone who hasn't read it yet, that was like a great presentation you gave of it, and I hope it inspires you all to read it. Marcus, fabulous questions. I love that. And I want to begin by recognizing that this book is like a virtuoso study in urban studies and institutional analysis, and in a really elegant variation finding 2-case comparative method. And so, but like, I'm not going to spend a lot of time like going through all the praises of the book. I think Marcus caught some of them, but wow, great, wonderful empirical research that it's based on. And just to situate what I'm going to say, I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit in terms of what we're talking about. My own PhD was supervised by one of the, preeminent comparative historical sociologists, Charles Tilly, back in the 1990s. And it involved a two-case comparison of popular democratization movements in a different historical context, post-revolutionary Haiti and post-emancipation Jamaica. And so I really appreciate the structure of what you're doing with this kind of two-case comparison and how well it works here. And back in the 1990s, when I was doing my doctoral work, many sociologists were starting to bring the state back in. That was like the turn towards bringing the state back in, and also towards institutional analysis. It kind of arose in that period. And so, Ben has called here for bringing not just the state back in, but bringing the city back in and focusing on institutions, not just at the state level, but at the urban governance level. So it's a great, leap forward in the context of the sort of sweep of sociology in that period. But there's another thing that's been happening in the sweep of that period, which relates to the comments I'm going to bring to you. Because at the same time that turn towards the state and institutionalism were happening, there was also the beginning of what was called the spatial turn in the 1990s, and then what became the mobilities turn in the early 2000s. And that's the turn my own work took towards what we call critical mobility studies or the new mobilities paradigm. So the comments I want to make are to take everything you've said and recognizing how fabulous it is, but to ask, what is missing or overlooked? And I'm going to briefly sketch three possible areas that come out of mobility studies to bring maybe a slightly different perspective to the analysis of urban power. So the first, I'm going to talk about urban space versus urban mobilities. In conceptualizing these three urban public goods, housing, transportation, and sanitation, I don't know whether to call you Ben or Bradlow. I wrote Bradlow here, but let's say Ben. We're all friends now. Ben measures the distribution of these three, what he calls urban public goods, using what you could call a distributive justice lens. So in asking, why are some cities more effective than others at reducing inequality, his answer is urban power, which he defines as, quote, the formal and informal social relations that produce governing institutions that manage the distribution of public goods across the space of the city. Okay, so that's why I call it distributive justice. You have the space of the city, you have a distribution of urban goods across that. And what I notice in this account is that it holds the space of the city still as a kind of background. It's this background across which public goods, housing, transportation, sanitation, whole neighborhoods are distributed. And they're distributed in more or less equitable or inequitable ways in the two cities you're looking at. So the city itself, Johannesburg or São Paulo, exists and is represented almost as a sort of taken for granted spatial unit. Because when you're doing a two-case comparison, you need a unit, right? The city is your unit. And it gives us almost a kind of what I call a Euclidean geometry, a Euclidean territory across which public goods are distributed. Some people get more access and inclusion than others. And there's always, in this kind of comparative analysis, a tension between, and in urban studies generally, pinning a city down to study it. And like you need measurements, you need something. You're like pinning it like a butterfly. You're like, I gotta study what's happening in this city, versus seeing it as a kind of living butterfly, a mobile metamorphosis, an ongoing changing thing over time. And you do bring time in, and I recognize that also. But what I notice in the detailed stories of the two cities in your beautiful empirical kind of research is an incredible amount of motion and mobility and movement in not just the population, but in the urban form itself. in the infrastructure, in the spatial production of the city and the region. So in the mobilities approach that I use in my own work, or that can be seen in urban studies like Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin's book, Splintered Urbanism, the city itself is a mobile assemblage of shifting scope and scale, flows and rhythms. The peripheries and the boundaries of it are constantly moving. Buildings rise and fall, neighborhoods come and go, migrants enter and leave, capital and labor flow across the city, and people undertake their daily rounds of life, not only by commuting, but by moving around, by provisioning, by moving things to them, to their needs. Electricity, water, sewage, waste, and air pollution also circulate, coursing through the bodies of individual people and through the infrastructure of the city itself, which extends out regionally and globally into that extended operational landscape of extraction that Neil Brenner and others have called planetary urbanization. So as capital, labor, migrants, residents, resources, and infrastructure move into and around the city, I would argue that they put places in play and they produce space itself. Every move affects the space-time geographies of the mobile city in dynamic ways that can extend from tiny things like viruses moving into our lungs to transport infrastructures spewing out air pollution and CO2 emissions, which are then driving climate warming and climate displacement. So crucially, the power to determine such mobilities and immobilities is always unevenly distributed and relational. So when urban planning or growth machines or managerialism improve one group's access to housing or transport or sanitation, improves the speed at which you might be able to cross the urban infrastructure, at the same time, they're always going to be excluding or slowing others. So people will be disconnected as others gain access. It's a two-sided coin. Infrastructure, therefore, is never simply a matter of equitable distribution alone, because it always excludes. Mobilities and immobilities are always relational and entangled. So what I did not hear, therefore, in the analysis of urban power was this appreciation of the power of urban space making or spatial production as a form of control over relational entangled geographies of dwelling and mobilities. The power, urban power, involves control over one's own potential mobility and control over the mobility of others. The power comes in who determines that, the sort of what we sometimes call mobile sovereignty, to self-determine your own mobilities. And that, to me, is more than a matter of distributive justice. And so what would happen to the account if we gave more attention to this relation between the production of space and the production of mobilities, immobilities, and infrastructural moorings? How is housing connected to transportation and sanitation, not as separate realms, but as co-constituted along with political subjects with differentiated embodiments in unequally privileged or stigmatized places? So for those of us who focus on questions of mobility justice, we would argue that the lived embodied experiences through which these entangled mobilities and immobilities are practiced are connected not only to basic distributive justice, but also to questions of deliberative and procedural justice and reparative and epistemic justice. And in your wonderful accounts of the embeddedness of urban governance in social movements, I think we begin to see some of the elements of deliberative and procedural justice in terms of who's included in decision-making. You describe this strong accountability of São Paulo's urban institutions to the social movements. And that's what distinguishes their more equitable distribution of public goods on some dimensions from what occurs in Johannesburg. Because in Johannesburg, instead of that embeddedness, we see instead the phenomenon that you describe as ring fencing, an enclosure of private property, and a kind of what we might call white flight, or what you describe as venue shopping. And elite actors in Johannesburg were able to mobilize space to their advantage. They were able to use the regional jurisdictions to leverage urban power in ways that literally moved the city to new spatial locations, like you showed in your slide. In the face of racial liberation and democratization, white elites exercised the power of mobility and the mobility of power to make new exclusionary urban forms. They moved the city region itself. And therefore, we see how control over mobility is one of the key weapons of the strong, as you nicely framed it. Okay, so that's the longest of my arguments, but that brings me to my second one, intersectionality and reproductive mobilities. So the intersectionality of gender, race, and class, and color, we could say. Specifically, I want to highlight how women's reproductive labor drives specific kinds of struggles for urban power. Chapter 1 of the book, when you read it, opens with the story of a woman named Marisa Dutra Alves, who has a 2-hour commute to her job as a domestic worker in São Paulo. And she ends up joining the movement for self-build comparative housing. When we get into this rest of the book, though, we don't hear too much about women like her. We don't hear too much about poor women's actual everyday mobilities, the reproductive labor of domestic work, of child rearing, of caring for the elderly within the informal settlements, of cleaning, of carrying water and waste into and out of the neighborhoods, right? Poor racialized women bear the brunt of unequal urban infrastructure and unjust social urban governance. And I'm going to draw on a little bit of research from Latin America, which shows that domestic workers face particularly intense mobility challenges, and their commutes have been reported as the longest in relation to every other urban worker. And I'm drawing on work by Montoya Robledo et al. I can give people the citation later. So domestic workers, these Latin American writers argue, rely on informal transit or long walks to reach bus stations, to reach their employers' homes and their own homes. They have to pay especially high expenses because of poorly designed fare systems, which you talk about in the book. They have the labor of actually walking and getting to their jobs, which is a further extraction of unpaid reproductive labor, if they do the reproductive labor of the households of the elite as domestic workers. And this is what I call their reproductive mobilities of poor women, which usually fall outside the consideration of formal labor movements and workers' movements. That social movement unionism, trade unionism, is often constituted by men. So how would the story of urban power change if we centered poor and Black women's mobilities, including what I call these intersectional mobilities of reproduction? And in a new chapter that I've co-authored in a book, I left a flyer out on the table. It's in the Handbook of Gender and Mobilities. I wrote a chapter with Paula Castaneda and Ariana Solis. And we argue that there's a growing body of research showing that mobilities involved in reproductive care work are unevenly distributed and configured through these intersectional relations of gender, class, race, colonialism, sexual violence, and geopolitics. And for us, that's why mobility justice is not just about transportation within cities or infrastructure, although that's an important part of it, but also about what we call the smaller micro mobilities at the bodily scale that are inflected by racial and class processes, gendered practices, the social shaping of disabilities and sexualities. So mobility and justice is not just a problem of transportation access or marginalized informal housing, but it's deeply implicated in the reproduction of racialized and gendered capitalist relations that capture women's unpaid or underpaid work, which is often rendered invisible and relegated along these highly racialized and classed lines in cities in the global South as well as the global North. So in the book, I think there's this crucial but neglected part of the story that is about where does the embeddedness of the social movements begin from how is it that it occurs in a way, besides the fact that you said the ANC demobilized the social movements in Johannesburg, but I felt like there's more to the story there. And that in Sao Paulo, you say how it originates with the administration of Erundina, Luisa Erundina, who's known as a woman of the people. She comes from the rural Northeast. She became the first Workers' Party mayor of Sao Paulo. And as the chapter on housing shows, she created the sort of basis on which later subsequent administrations like Marcus Suplicy's were able to create more effective cohesion. And the administrations were successful in that due to the underlying deliberative dynamics and what I would call an epistemic perspective from below or from outside, from the periphery that Erundina represented. And we see that in the chapter on sanitation also. If we pay more attention to the role of poor women and marginalized women and Black women in these social movements in the years that build up to this sort of embeddedness and cohesion that you describe happening, I think we can see more clearly what did not occur in Johannesburg, where politics remained, I would think, more male-dominated, less democratizing in that inclusive sense, less focused on women's challenges to the urban power structure. So the failure to provide sanitation in Johannesburg is also linked to the racialized and gendered spatial mobilities of the post-apartheid era, which scattered informal urbanization across the peripheries and probably broke down women's social networks and ability to mobilize social movements to make their claims. And for me, this is probably what helped undermine the formation of collective movements and a specifically feminist subaltern public in South Africa that would have had deliberative influence and procedural inclusion in decision-making. And I think that shows why, in the very end of the book, you point us towards a more recent event that happened. It shows why the assassination of Marielle Franco in March 2018 was such a crucial political event in Brazil. She was a socialist, feminist, human rights activist, and single mother from the favelas. She was a Black woman who defended and represented poor Black women, and she was assassinated because that's what really poses a threat to the urban power of the elites, is the mobilization of women like her. So finally, sorry I'm taking a little long, I'm going to get to just one brief final comment on mobile publics. So communicative mobilities or mobile publics is an idea of communication that extends across urban publics with different kinds of communication styles. And the book touches on this and the way in which you describe the failure of organizational actors in Johannesburg to sort of embed transportation policymaking. And you could say this is due to the lack of an urban public sphere that practices active, deliberative, and procedural justice. It fails to bring in the relevant participants like the taxi drivers, who you mentioned, or we could say like Black women. And in the place of that, we see violence amongst those sectors of the taxi drivers. And I want to just say like that what happens in that absence of a public is we get transnational policy transfer, which is bus rapid transit. We didn't talk about that part of the book so much today, but it's through entities like the World Bank and international expos and global funding mechanisms and urban boosters and investors that BRT was brought to cities around the global south. And they're able to do that because of the absence of deliberative procedural justice in the urban public sphere in a way. The power of collective transportation providers in Sao Paulo is a kind of mobility power. And the transportation sector there is crucial for understanding contemporary urban inequalities, not just because it's an urban public good, but because it's a central arena of kino-political struggle, that is struggle over the politics of mobility, how we get around, and the mobility of politics, of who's included in the discursive public sphere. So building equitable urban infrastructure is not never simply about a spatial distributive fix to bring more housing or buses or sanitation to the peripheral neighborhoods. It has to be about mobilizing collective movements and spaces of deliberation for the marginalized to assert their own epistemic vision for the city. And I'll just conclude by saying, like, whose idea of the city prevails? Who decides what constitutes an urban public good? And with Maria Franco, we see that there's a vision which is about the inclusion of women, and it's a kind of bringing to light the city and urban power in the city. It's making the butterfly fly rather than pinning it down. Up there.
Thank you, Mimi. This is such a deep and provocative set of reflections. And not only have you made a very deep critique of the book, but you read it in a way that kind of, like, the way you brought up implications of what my answers might be to your critique. It is just I'm full of admiration for how you did that. I want to start with the gender component, because I think that's where I see how you've just brought up these implications, that it's certainly correct that it's not very central to the theoretical apparatus of the book. And in a way, I totally agree with you that is a curious omission, because the housing movement, very distinct from the trade union sphere, for example. Housing movements have long in many parts of the world thematized the reproductive labor component of the residential setting and demands around residential public goods. That's certainly true in both of these cases, that many of the movements are women-led movements that thematize the housing issue. I suspect, I haven't investigated through this theoretical lens, but some of what you say about the possibility of a more male-dominated political sphere in Johannesburg, that certainly jibes with my impressions of my fieldwork, that including that many of the bureaucrats who held similar positions that I interviewed in Johannesburg to Sao Paulo, many of those bureaucrats would be men in Johannesburg, and many more would be women in Sao Paulo. Now that's in the bureaucratic sphere, but I actually think it's a bit downstream from an earlier story that you're pointing to, which is a lot of it has to do with the mayor. So not only was Erundina a woman, but she was a social worker who had worked for a long time in the peripheries. I think the fact that she had the profession of a social worker prior to entering politics was important. Certainly, the women leaders in movements who I talked to, who had interacted with her, described a kind of connection that I'm just kind of thinking as you're talking of things that people said. It was talking about almost a female friendship in the way that they described their interactions with her, the older leaders that I interviewed. And so I think that gender actually is perhaps like the unspoken or relatively unspoken dimension of this book, notwithstanding that I begin and end the book with the one story that you mentioned in the Marielle Franco story in the conclusion. But I'm very appreciative of the way you drew out those connections. Then the one way that I would think about your critique about the taken for granted spatial unit of the city is to put it in less critical language. This is about the metropolitanization of the city, and the urbanization of the city produces an informalization of the city that over time extends beyond the administrative boundaries of the city. That's at least one form of the kind of mobility that you're describing. And in part, it's a limitation of the research design. And it's a limitation that it was a considered limitation, but I think it provided other advantages, which is, from the perspective of municipal government operates through a sense of fixed space. And that's a limited view of how municipal government operates. But if you want to study goals that can reasonably be, I don't know, maybe this is too much of a kind of positivist framing for the kinds of critiques that you're bringing in here. But the kinds of things that municipal bureaucrats are trying to do are necessarily going to be based on a planning apparatus that conceives of the city at the municipal scale and can't deal with the metropolitan scale. In both of these cities, there's quite an active discourse around metropolitan governance, and that could account for at least some of the kinds of mobilities that you describe. But this is, I think what you're describing exposes a limitation of the kinds of governing apparatuses that are available in most of the world. And particularly for thinking about the municipal scale, the municipal government is only empowered to deal with the municipal scale. And that's kind of how I see, that's how I understood taking the space of the city for granted as something that was a reasonable methodological choice to make. But I think in terms of the experience from below, it's certainly an incomplete way of thinking about urban experience for precisely the reasons that you provide.
Thanks. Good answers. Just a quick round of applause and then some very. So we've only time probably for one or two questions, but certainly over drinks and nibbles, I think we have more. So, yeah.
In the context of social movements in São Paulo, I actually was talking to Professor Walton about this earlier today in the class. Okay. In the context of social movements in São Paulo, I was thinking about this earlier today when I was in Professor Walton's class. What do you think is the reason behind social movements there and why they are lacking in other major cities like Rio de Janeiro?
Yeah. So Rio did have strong social movements, and in fact, a key competitor in the 80s for the mantle of kind of like the political leader of the national working class came out of urban movements in Rio, in a different left political party. But you don't see, so for one thing, that party never reaches a kind of projection in key cities, including in Rio, in large southeastern cities, the relatively wealthy part of the country, compared to what the PT does in the late 80s and early 90s, where you have a series of PT-led municipal governments. And so you don't see movements in Rio getting that early traction in the municipal government sphere that I'm arguing in Sao Paulo. It's that early traction that produces a degree of what we might think of as path dependence in constructing a more resilient sphere of movements that persists over time across multiple generations, and in fact, different movements entirely across time in Sao Paulo. And so in Rio now you have very neighborhood focused movements, but you have no kind of citywide movement sphere like you see in Sao Paulo.
Sure. Thanks so much. There's a lot of things I've pulled out of the book, but I sort of have a so what question at the end, which is, you know, the UDF reappears, and now
In South Africa.
In South Africa, yes, sorry. And so now in Joburg in particular, right?
Yeah.
And as Marcus was saying, like there's a lot of stickiness here in the way that the norms in terms of embeddedness and cohesion are operating there. How does a movement then interrupt right that? And then on the reverse side, right, if we go to Sao Paulo, right, does it take a particularly unusual leader at the local or national level, like a Bolsonaro or something even more extreme, to disrupt their ability to constantly engage? Like what moves people back off of these tracks now that we've had 2 decades of them being in the new squares that they were in?
Yeah, you know, in a way, this is a somewhat path-dependent story. So it's hard to get out of that red tier box in particular. And one reason why it's hard, in a way, speaks to some of the concerns that Mimi was raising, which is the nature of urbanization in Johannesburg has grown in a way that exceeds the organizational capacities that I think or the organizational structures that are articulated in a more kind of bourgeois part of civil society in South Africa. And when you look at the emergence of the new United Democratic Front, it's not the same thing at all. They're just using the name, though there are actually a few individuals who link those things together. But it's a much more middle-class, educated set of activists who are organizing that. Whereas the UDF certainly had this middle-class component in the 80s, but there were a number of grassroots groups that came through an organizational language and a set of organizational structures that that could be understood as organic in those spaces, and the kinds of organizational structures that exist in informal spaces today in a context like Johannesburg don't appear to link well to the kinds of organizational structures that get proposed and initiated through these middle-class activist formations.
Right, I think given we've got refreshments, we should probably kind of cut it off there.